So the purpose of tonight's meeting is just to introduce our firms and talk a little bit about the Community Recreation Center feasibility study that we're going to be completing over the next 3 to 4 months. So just to kind of jump in and talk a little bit about our firms, I'm Brian Connolly. I'm the founder and managing principal of Victus Advisors, and we also have Alan Dostard here with us, who is a partner with EAPC Architects and Engineers. Victus Advisors, my firm, is headquartered in Park City, Utah, and we do recreation facility, event facility, sports facility, different types of public venue, assembly venue, and recreation and event type facility studies all over the country. So we've done more than 100 of these just in the last 10 years, all over the United States and over 35 states. So this is what we do. We focus on the research and planning phases of these studies. We don't build the facilities, we don't operate them. Our focus is on research and planning. So what that means is we're independent, we're objective. Our only goal for these studies is to help communities analyze the feasibility of the project from a market standpoint, from an economic standpoint, and from a financial standpoint. So there's communities where we come in and we say, you know what, there's tons of demand for this, you've got the money to pay for it, you've got, there's a viable operating model, here's a plan and you can build it tomorrow. And there's communities where we go in where we say, hey, there's no demand, or there's no viable operating model, you don't have a funding model, whatever that might be, and this might not be feasible from a market standpoint or a financial standpoint or whatever it might be. So, when you work with us, you get that sort of independent perspective on what is feasible, is there a path forward, if so, what decisions need to be made, and how do you potentially move forward. And we just want to be honest with you and truthful with you about what opportunities there are in this community. So, our process is really data driven. It's based on market research and analysis of your community and comparable projects. And we do a lot of community engagement and custom market research, and we try to be able to come back then and based upon the market research results, quantify what is truly the financial and operational feasibility of a project like this. I'll let Alan talk a little bit about his firm, EAPC. Like I said, we lead the market, financial, and economic components of the study, and then Alan's firm, and I'll explain this a little bit more in a few slides, then based upon the results of our study comes in and does a lot of the initial planning in terms of architectural concepts and cost estimates and things like that.
Okay. Hi, I'm Alan Dostard. I'm the president and CEO of EAPC. EAPC is an architecture and engineering firm. We have been around for about 55 years. We do this type of building quite a bit. We're general practitioners in one sense, but we do a lot of this type of work. We have offices across North Dakota, South Dakota, Minnesota. We have an office in Fort Collins, Colorado. We have an office in Phoenix, Arizona. So we're really concentrated in the Midwest of the lower 48. Have worked together on several projects, taking a look at providing. Basically, I'm here to provide support for their study, and by that support, I'm not here to start designing anything at this point. I'm here right now on this trip to listen and to, more than anything, take a look at the sites and do some site analysis, because it's going to be my job to take a look and see how all of this fits together. When the study is complete, we'll take that data and we'll turn into diagrammatic floor plans, diagrammatic conceptual, and two things that we do is see how it fits the site, and then it's our job to really sit down and do that first pass for estimates to see what this might cost once we have that data. But it's not our job whatsoever to say, well, here's what you guys should have. We're going to respond to the data that's given us and move from there. That's our support role in this project.
So in terms of the study we're going to be completing, you know, at a high level, we've got a couple of primary goals for the study. So obviously the City of Seward engaged Victus and EAPC to conduct a feasibility study for a community recreation center. So what does that really mean? You know, from the Victus perspective, in terms of market, financial, and economic feasibility, you know, we start off with market research. So we want to determine what the indoor recreational needs and market demand is for a new community recreation center in Seward. Who are the users going to be? What are the programs that can be offered? You know, ultimately, in terms of indoor recreation space in this community, what are the needs? And honestly, we look at, as Alan mentioned, a lot of times when architects come in and just start designing without sort of a feasibility-led process like we're doing here, you know, they come in and they go to me and say, well, what do you want? What would you like us to draw? And so you oftentimes get these initial concepts that are very grandiose and have everything anybody could possibly want, but that doesn't mean that that's going to be feasible from a financial standpoint, feasible from an operational and market standpoint. So we kind of flip the script on that, and we start off with the market research. What is, not necessarily the wants, but what are the needs that are either currently being met or aren't being met yet, so we can narrow down to, you know, what's the existing demand in the marketplace that there aren't facilities to serve right now. So we try to do that market demand, market feasibility identification first. Then we do operational analysis. So based upon the market need and the type of facility that they're, you know, could meet that need, how would it be operated? So who operates it? You know, who are the users? How often do they use it? Is there seasonality to the usage? Here I expect there very much would be between winter and summer for an indoor facility. And then how does that translate into revenues, operating expenses on an annual basis? Is this a facility that would need ongoing funding to help support it? Is this one that would break even? Is this one that could produce enough operating income to be able to have additional cash flow you could put into a long-term reserve fund to be able to maintain the facility with additional upgrades and things like that? And that's different in every market for every type of facility. So we do the operational analysis, and then from a financial feasibility standpoint, you know, once we've projected that annual financial operating performance, we also look at, you know, what are the other long-term costs? You know, it's the initial construction. You know, how do you pay for that? What are the funding models for that? It's the ongoing operations, like we talked to, that need to be supported. How is that, you know, how is that paid for? And then there's also that long-term capital management. So, you know, the last thing we want to see happen is one of our clients gets a facility built, but they haven't planned for sustaining that, and that there's no ability to reinvest in the facility. That, you know, we hate to see deferred maintenance is what it's called, where, you know, there's money that should be being invested in for different types of systems and for different types of building components and things every couple of years to maintain those. And if that's not done, then that builds up. It's called deferred maintenance, and those numbers can get big if the facility's not maintained properly. So, you know, we're focused on market demand, operational analysis, financial feasibility, whereas EAPC is going to really focus on, after we've completed our market analysis in particular in terms of what there's demand for, then they're going to come in and help fill in some of the gaps in terms of, I can let you talk about that.
Yeah, there's really three things that we do, and I talked about this a little bit earlier, is we prepare what's called concept plans. They'll look like floor plans, they'll look like a building, there'll be a shape, there'll be a look, but it's certainly not meant to be that's what this building will be. What it does is take set data, puts it into a concept, and we test that concept on various sites, and we would task with looking at least 3 sites to see how this concept might fit on those sites and what are the advantages and disadvantages in terms of traffic flow, parking, orientation, all those sort of things, image. So we'll evaluate all that, and then the last piece, which is really important, is sitting down and putting cost models on that project. And our cost models aren't just brick and mortar. We take a look at FF&E, furniture, fixtures, those kind of things that you need to operate the building. And I'll just anecdotally add just a quick thing about a project that was actually done very close to where I live by a competing firm. And it was in a city in North Dakota that has a tremendous amount of oil impact. Bakken oil formation is just pumping money into the economy. They built a $75 million wellness and fitness community center in a community for 60,000 people. They had all the money in the world. And it now sits 2/3 of it goes in the dark. There's no one inside the building. So that's the whole, when he talks about, architects being turned loose, and I don't want to talk bad about architects. I don't want to talk bad about architects, but, given that situation, there's a perfect storm. The architects are turned loose, here's your budget, huge budget. No one said, whoa, what do you need? What's not being served? They just built and built and built, and now this building sits there. They rented it out to the Roughneckers for about a year or two, and when most of the rigs pulled out, those guys pulled out, and now the building sits 2/3 empty. And so we really want to make sure that this is right size and it's appropriate for your community. And that's, I'm part of that, to make sure that it's matching what the data tells us. That's what we do.
And we worked with Downstate on a couple other projects where, it really, for us to properly do our job from a financial feasibility standpoint, we need to know what is buildings like this gonna cost. And if we don't know that, we can't tell you, at the end of the day, is this financially feasible? Is this something that there's a plan to pay for building it, operating it, sustaining it? So Alan's team helps us bring that full circle. They can take.
Good evening. The library's closing in 15 minutes.
They can take the market research results, turn it into a floor plan and a site plan. Again, all conceptual. It's not a final design by any stretch of the imagination. But to turn it into a floor plan and a site plan, and that they can then run through their cost models to come back and say, okay, this is what it's really going to cost to build that, and then we can, complete the circle on the financial feasibility calculations.
So the other thing that we're doing right now in this trip is looking at the site, preparing the data for those sites in terms of utilities, improvements, what's the total, the contours of the site, all those sort of things, pulling that information together so that we can respond in an appropriate way. Even to the point where getting some names and some numbers of some contractors and subcontractors that serve this area, because in the construction industry right now is pretty precarious in terms of COVID and inflation. And in our case, in the Midwest, especially North Dakota, we went through a boom and bust with oil. And oil made the square foot cost of buildings go through the roof. Then the oil disappeared, if you will, and slowed down the rates. And then COVID and inflation hit. And so we are used to working in what I call an irritated economy. And so I feel like we could dial in and do some interviews and talk to people about projects and what they cost in this region, and do a good job of getting the numbers dialed in, so it's a very reliable number as we go forward.
So just to help you see our overall project approach a little bit better, this is kind of a visualization of our whole methodology. So the first phase is going to be our market research phase. So that's really the upper half of this diagram. We'll show you a timeline to go through this in a minute as well. But the black and red boxes are Victus's research process. So the black boxes here are what we call secondary market research, and that's where we go out and we look at existing data that's out there. We have various demographic and socioeconomic data tracking databases where we keep an eye on population trends, growth trends, income trends, all that type of stuff. So we'll do a demographic and socioeconomic analysis. We're already in the process of trying to inventory the facilities that are currently being used locally and regionally for indoor recreation programs as well. Trying to identify all the programs that are being offered for recreation, whether they're privately run or publicly run. And then also looking at regional recreation and sports facility inventory as well. So not just what's serving the the day-to-day, a lot of times weekday needs as well of Seward residents, but also what are some comparable communities in Alaska that have built indoor recreation facilities of various types, what are the best practices they've learned from those, so we can kind of look regionally as well to get some benchmarks. So that's that secondary market research. We also have a primary research and community engagement process we're working through. Today was day one of that process, so we're obviously doing this public information session as we speak, and then we started our stakeholder interview process as well today, and we'll be here tomorrow doing stakeholder interviews. Stakeholder interviews are usually your sort of community leaders. That's we met with some city staff, we met with Parks and Rec, we met with various foundation leaders, we met with some economic development folks from the Peninsula Bureau, and we'll be meeting with some more folks like that tomorrow as well, some representatives from the medical center, kind of some folks like that, just to get sort of the lay of the land. Over the next couple of weeks, we're also going to be conducting some user group interviews. What that means is leaders of groups that could potentially rent space in a facility like this. If there's basketball courts, basketball groups, and volleyball groups. We'll talk to wrestling folks. We'll talk to ice hockey and ice sports folks. We'll talk to aquatics folks, all that sort of stuff. So those will be interviews we'll complete over the next couple of weeks, probably through telephone interviews, video conferences, things like that. We're also going to be issuing a community recreation survey. So that should be going out here probably in about 3-4 weeks. That's going to be an online survey. So it's going to go out through a lot of different channels to try to get to as many people as we can. So we've asked the city to send it out through their Parks and Recreation database. It'll be posted on various social media channels of the city. We're also going to ask the sports group organizers to send that out to their parents and coaches as well. So keep an eye out for that over the next, probably, like I said, probably in about 3 weeks that should be going out. And if you get it, you're welcome to forward it to friends as well and ask them to take it. But our goal is typically to get at least 350 responses for that survey, so that we have a statistically relevant sample for that. And that's going to ask the community more broadly about what are their recreational interests, where are they able to participate in their areas of recreational focus now, are there places they have to travel to outside the community to be able to meet those needs? Are there any examples of things they'd like to see? How would they prioritize different types of amenities within a recreation center, all those types of questions. So based upon the various types of research we do, we then come back with our initial building program recommendation. That is not necessarily, as I said, a wants list, that's more of a needs list. It's us saying, okay, based upon all of this research we've done, here's what there's demand for and a need for. If there's something that is already being met, then we're going to say, hey, the demand for this element is already being met. You don't need to add anything new. Whereas if there's something where there's a community here that just there's demand for a certain type of recreational use, and it's not being met at all by the current facilities, then we'll identify that as well. And knowing that this is these types of venues are really a public amenity, that's meant to meet the needs of the community. We're not trying to, recommend anything that's going to directly compete with something that's already doing something and doing it well. So it's trying to find what are the gaps in this market that a new community recreation center can help fill and help meet more needs, not necessarily compete with anything that's already doing that well. So at that point, once we come up with this sort of demand profile, that's when we shift into our analysis phase and conceptual phases. So on the VICTA side, we'll put together an operating pro forma for the recommended facility type. we'll do an analysis of who owns it, who operates it, and we'll do a funding options analysis as well, which is how do you pay for it. And at the same time, Alan's team will be working through the building project assessment, which is looking at the different sites, coming up with a conceptual floor plan, testing it on some sites, and telling us what they think the cost could be for a facility of this type. So all of that gets rolled into ultimately our final report, which is usually a very thick document that summarizes each of these elements you see up on the screen. So typically, each of those bubbles on there will be its own section with here's the research we did, here's what the findings were, here's how that translated into our recommendation, and here's the various types of analysis on what that could be, how that could be operated, what that could cost. Overall, we're looking at about I think it's about a 14-week timeline. So literally starting this week, we came into town last night, we're here today, tomorrow. We've been doing a lot of meetings today. We did some tours of some existing recreational venues and sites in town. And then we really start getting down to nuts and bolts on our research process. So as you can see, we're hoping to have the survey come out, be issued by the end of the month. So like I said, keep an eye out for that survey. About an 8 to 9 week research process, at which point we then start translating the research results into our assessment of demand and need and what that facility might be. And then we work on our sort of operational and financial analysis as Alan's team works through some of the concepts and cost estimates. So all in all, we're looking at having an initial draft of our report in early to mid-August. Typically then there's, we work through edits and everything before there's a public release of the document. So I would say by end of August, typically we'll likely have that full report ready. Hopefully that's something that provides you with value. You can look at it and make decisions about how you as a community want to proceed. At that point, knowing all of the data, knowing all of the numbers, knowing the risks, the rewards, the pros, the cons, and everything in between. So it's really about giving you all as a community all of the information, all of the tools you need to make informed decisions about how you want to move forward. So that's kind of where we're at right now and how we're going to be approaching this over the next 3 to 4 months. In addition to the online survey, we're also have an email address set up, Seward Recreation Center at victusadvisors.com. You're welcome. We're going to open it up to any comments or questions here in a minute. We ask, even if you stand up and make a comment here or ask a question here, if you also want to send any comments you have to the email address as well, so that's kind of recorded in the ledger, so to speak. That would be great. You're welcome to share the email address with any friends or partners you have as well, to be able to submit input, comments, and questions there. And as I said, keep an eye out for the survey as well, because that's going to be the best opportunity for most people to be able to provide their feedback in an organized way. So at this point, is there anybody who has questions about the process and what we're going to be doing over the next couple of months?
Could ask if there's a place in the process where we can provide input on progress in case there's a draft at the very end, right? So ask, or did you think about this or that? Thank you, but not tracking.
So, we will have sort of an interim presentation where we talk about, it's really to city staff about halfway through, where we present what the results of our research has been so far. But I think ultimately, the final document that we put in front of the public is where I think you have the opportunity to then review that in full, and come back and say, you know, like I said, this is something we think makes sense, or it doesn't make sense, or, you know, I think at that point, at the end of our process is when we put the full package in front of the public.
You had mentioned particular user group uses for the building.
Right.
And because we're in such a small area and multi-seasonal, obviously we're gonna need multiple user groups to make it
Correct.
financially feasible.
Yeah.
So my question is what, if any, user groups have you identified already? And at what point will you start reaching out to ideas about?
So we started the process today of trying to start identifying who some of those groups can be. So we asked Parks and Rec to provide some information on programs they run, on who their current renters are that rent space or operated things in current facilities. And each of the stakeholders we've met with, we've asked them about, you know, what are the sports clubs, things like that exist in this community. So we're literally in the process of trying to build that list. You know, in other communities, it's, you know, potentially been there, you know, obviously basketball, volleyball, wrestling.
The library is now closed. Please exit the building and have a good evening.
Anything can be done indoor. We've talked to futsal groups, which is indoor soccer on hardcourt. We've talked about pickleball. But every community is different. So ice hockey, figure skating,
Walking tracks.
right? Yeah, track and field. We usually, even for indoor studies, we talk to soccer and baseball because they can use indoor artificial turf. So yeah, we want to talk to as many different user groups as we can. You know, typically that's, like I said, those are private sector groups, a lot of them nonprofit, that in any facility that's built would be a user, typically through some type of rental agreement, things like that. So yeah, we're building that list right now. If there's anybody you think we should talk to, you want to make sure is on that list, again, send an email to SewardRecreationCenter@TexasAdvisors.com and say, you know, I'm so-and-so, I'd like to talk to you about this. Or say, you know, here's a couple organizations you should make sure are on your list. And that way we can make sure we don't miss anybody that could be a potential user group.
So I guess my follow-up question would be, have you created multi-use? I know that you've mentioned rec, right? So recreational center.
That's meant as a very broad.
It's extremely broad, and the source of revenue with the size of our area for a rec center, if we're just talking about recreational use, it's going to be, in my opinion, is the cost benefit ratio or the ROI on it is going to take a long time. So do you also make suggestions on, for example, a user group like an event center or a concert venue or multi-use?
Yeah. I mean,
more economic drivers, I guess.
Right. So there's trade-offs. There's always trade-offs, and we'll you know, walk through that with, you know, as part of this study too, where, you know, typically something that's just focused on local community need, if you draw what local is pretty narrowly, is going to be a smaller facility, because you're talking about serving a smaller community, you know, not as far of a drive time range that you're drawing people from, and so that's going to be honestly more of your community facility, your community center, your community recreation center. So you're not going to have as much, like you said, as much money flowing through it, but you're also not going to spend as much to build it. So that's what we're always looking at when we say financial feasibility. There's there's the cost of building it, then there's the cost of operating it, and then there's also the economic impact that can be associated with it. So, you know, there's trade-offs to that. So it might be more affordable, and within, again, we're just starting to study, we don't know yet.
Right.
It might be more affordable to build a smaller community-focused facility from a construction cost standpoint. But then we have to look at the operations and see, can those operations be supported in this community? Is it creating new tax revenues that can help pay for some of those costs? We'll also look at and set up some calls with not just local sports user groups, but regional organizations, other governing bodies and larger sports organizations that are active statewide, and ask them about, would you come to a facility here if it had enough courts, enough ice sheets, enough, the things that you would need to host a tournament, for example. And we'll say, from our experience, you talk to them and they say, oh, you're gonna do 2 basketball courts for the local community? Well, guess what? We're not coming unless you have 6. Just do a tournament, things like that. And so usually, and we've done a lot of these models, a community facility might be this big and cost X, but then if you want to expand it to be able to attract larger events, now it's going to be bigger and cost more to build. But there are those additional increment, economic benefits that you can generate through what we call sports tourism, which is traveling for 2 or 3 day tournaments and staying overnight and spending money in restaurants and hotels and all that. Especially if we're talking about indoor facility, most of that's going to occur during the winter. So yeah, that's absolutely part of our analysis. And a lot of times, we'll kind of present some alternatives saying, look, here's what that community facility might look like, and here's what that economic development facility might look like. And you know what, if you want to go for the bigger one, we think you can afford it. Or by the way, yeah, that's a great idea, but we don't think that's financially feasible. We'll tell you that. So.
If I could just add something real quick. Another potential user group, which is also a big potential revenue stream and or sponsoring stream is your healthcare organizations. These facilities, we've been talking rec, community center rec, but there's a certain amount of wellness that can go into these as well, and that serves community, and it can be we've done several ourselves where the local healthcare group actually rents a significant amount of square feet, and they provide programs on dietary things and wellness and all these sort of things, even to the point where they have an exam room in the facility. So we haven't met with those folks yet. Those folks are all on the list
Right.
to talk to and find out what's that interest.
Yeah, we've seen that a lot of places where a regional medical center or physical therapy center, things like that. We've seen sports medicine offices within these facilities. We've seen physical therapy and training, aquatic therapy. We've seen ones where there's partnerships with like sports training groups, things like that. So there are other things you can do from a revenue standpoint if the market demand is there. You can't just build something and hope they come. That's how you get stuck with some empty spaces.
Yeah.
But we'll look into that, and regional medical groups in particular have been a growing trend. As Alan mentioned, where we've seen them commit funds to help build it in return for naming rights to the facility, and or rent out space within it to run some of their wellness programs and things like that. So we'll look into all of that.
Could it not just, I know that we keep saying community center which makes it sound like the city of Seward is the one paying to build the building. Another option, obviously, would be that we put together this prospectus or the feasibility business plan, as it really is, and then outside investors would then see that it could generate revenue from different aspects and could possibly then say, hey, that's a great idea, we'll fund it, we'll do it, and operate it as a for-profit style.
It's certainly possible that that model for these types of indoor recreation facilities is, depending on what it's getting built, it's not as common as the publicly funded models. But that's a key part of our that regional inventory demand analysis. Is we're going to look at what similar communities have done, and we're going to profile what the facilities are and how are they built, who paid for them, who operates them, so that we can come back to you and say, okay, if this is a public facility, purely public facility, here's what's been done and how it's been done. If this is fully private, you know, here's what's been done and how it's been done. And, you know, in the middle, there's public-private partnerships. So we've worked on the whole spectrum. So, you know, hopefully we can come back and say, based upon our market profile and the opportunity we see here, we think that this type of model could be viable for you. Make some suggestions there, or at least give you some different options that could be pursued. And then, like I said, ultimately it's up to the community to look at what we come back with. And it's not cookie cutter, it's not boilerplate. We're gonna come back with customized recommendations for you all based on your community, and look at it and say, oh, well, you know, here's a couple different options they've laid out. We actually, let's see if this one can work and pursue that. Or there's times we came back and say, I don't know, there is a viable option here. So,
Okay, thank you.
yes.
Do you ever incorporate things like adding a cafe or a bar and grill, or even like spaces that businesses could rent? Like a gym could actually, instead of the city renting a gym, that a vendor actually comes in and rents space, or a laser
Absolutely.
tag rent space, or an arcade or something.
Sure, yeah, all the time. Yeah, I mean, if, a lot of it just depends on the volume of usage going through there. There's times where if it's not gonna be consistent enough, we'll say, hey, you know, we just do some vending machines. There's other times where, depending on the type of facility, for example, if it's a larger tournament facility, and there's enough demand that we see, you know, 30 weekends a year of tournaments coming through here on multiple courts or multiple ice sheets or whatever it might be. We've made recommendations for, you know, a centralized up high with feasible, you know, whole facility bar and grill is something you should look at, and potentially contracting with an operator to come and do that. So yeah, I mean, there's lots of stuff. We already talked about building leasable space. So there's a community in Indiana we've been working with where they've got a couple of different sort of sports performance trainers there that have all expressed interest. And so the facility we're helping them plan the conceptual analysis that the architects are drawing in, you know, a sports performance training space that, you know, in our operating model, we're recommending that they actually put out an RFP and negotiate a lease with an operator to provide that service. And then even in terms of programs, you know, that Parks and Recreation offers, with most of these indoor recreation facilities across the country, most of the Parks and Recreation departments we work with, they will, they're, you know, the first thing they'll do is they'll look at, okay, is there a local provider that can run this particular program for us? We have the space, now that we have the facility, but, you know, aerobics classes might be done by a local, you know, a local person that runs those types of training programs, or workout classes, things like that. So they're actually running it within the space. So that's very common as well, to have sort of those local contractors that have that expertise to be able to provide that with the facility. So yeah, we absolutely look at all those different types of models and ultimately what's gonna make the operations the most viable. So, yeah.
So, Brian, outside of the economics of it, which I think are very important, one of the big pressures on the community here is childcare. And is there the capacity to, or do you have experiences with seeing some other architectural structures that loop in some of the potential childcare support that can come in, and then you can get the synergy on the services? And are you going to be incorporating some of those folks? Because they're not truly recreational, but they are users of this type of.
Yeah, I mean, typically when it comes to indoor recreation facilities, childcare demand, there's some childcare demand that can be attached directly to the recreational facility in terms of, you know, but that depends on who the user is going to be. Let's say there's a big fitness component, for example, which is common in a lot of community recreation centers. And if a lot of the users are going to be parents that come in during the day and that have small children at home, you know, they're not going to be able to go run on the treadmill while their 2-year-old plays next to them.
The dual income families that we have here.
Right. Mm-hmm. Yeah. So we see a lot of fitness centers, for example, that we're helping plan now, they'll have a childcare component or area within the facility, where for an extra fee, you can, leave your child in that part of the facility for up to 2 hours or whatever that might be. But I'm not sure if you're talking about that or if you're talking about potentially having.
A child development center type.
In
Right.
actuals.
An actual, not Seward is a hard scrabble, hard-working town where you have family, but two working parents, in terms of the seasonality of it, working in different industries, and the need for childcare, while the parents are working in a safe place to be after school, for older kids, and that's what I'm talking about. It's
Okay.
As
As a
contributor.
dedicated full-time
Yes,
component of it.
not as a complement to getting on the treadmill or
Gotcha.
doing a class, but actual signing up as a child development center type model.
Sure.
So that's something that I'll email them, but I want to make
Okay,
sure those users, that's a major capacity. And one of the follow-up questions I have for you is when you look and you're coming into existing communities, how do you use your model to balance out the stovepipes or even like the Empire building that individuals do and they've got years and years devoted to a service and they found their facility. They might have a room or a building. And what this can potentially leverage is the synergy of bringing people together to offset some of those inefficiencies that create over time. I mean, and we see it regionally. It exists in other communities here in Alaska where niche groups pursue their service, their facility, and then it goes down the path of just caring for them. So how do you balance out those stakeholders, because they have an interest, they've cultivated their sports, their communities, how do you balance out what they already have with showing them the potential resources and services that you can provide at a better return? We have a pool that's got hundreds of thousands of dollars of annual debt of heating. We have other facilities that are kind of tucked away in the side corner where portions of our community want to come out. How do you help them present that?
Yeah, I mean, the honest answer is that's what we do.
That's huge. That's why I'm a huge fan of what you guys have done.
I think in communities where they don't have a broad-based community recreation center yet, like you said, everybody's kind of been in their silo and just focusing on doing the best with what they have and what they can get access to. So it's about trying to figure out who all those different groups are, go through that process, and then get an understanding of what they're doing now, what they could do, and this is going to be part of that user group interview process. What are you doing now? What could you do if you had unlimited access to whatever facilities you had? What could you do? Then what? In addition to what could you do within your kind of current parameters? Could you expand services? Could you create new events? Go through that discussion with them. And then part of it is us having those times, knowing what those types of groups can do when they have access to facilities. So all of that gets kind of baked into our eventual model we'll put forward. And I think too, and I know this is something that Alan's team understands as well when you actually start to design the facility. When you get to larger cities that are hundreds of thousands of people, you can have individual facilities that are dedicated to a particular use. It's like that's this facility for that group. Because they have such a large market that you can start to have specialized facilities that focus on different segments within the market, because even the segments are still big enough to support that because it's so much bigger. In communities that are under 20,000 people, let's say, which if you look at Seward and you look at probably within a 15 to 30 minute drive time range of Seward, you're probably looking at 5,000-6,000 people. When you start getting into communities that are smaller, it really becomes about multi-use. So you never want to design any room within that facility that's for this very specific purpose, this one only, so it's only going to be used Tuesdays and Thursdays from 5 to 7 p.m. and it's going to sit dark the rest of the time. That's how you lose money. So
here's an example of how some of those real flexible spaces translate into the built environment. And we do a room similar to this with the ability to subdivide it. We also typically, if If you want to have a lot more use for a room like this, if you have a serving kitchen or a kitchenette, so you can do meals or catering, those sort of things. But then you also have a window and a mirror, and you can use it for dietary cooking lessons and those sort of things. So all of a sudden, it's more than just a meeting room, it's a multi-purpose room, it takes on many, many things. And in a small community, we look for those opportunities as much as we possibly can.
We worked on a project with Alan in Wisconsin a few years ago. And we did the research, they translated into some physical concept. And, there were components of the facility where there's one area that they drew that it was designed so you had a concrete floor and you could put up boards for ice and you could set up an ice sheet there for certain parts of the year based upon demand, and then the boards could come out and take the ice out, and then there were roll-out artificial turf systems that could go down for other parts of the year when there was demand for Wisconsin, like Alaska. You've got baseball teams that are starting to train in February, but they can't actually go out and get on a field till now. And so there were indoor roll-out turf system could then go down, and even if they wanted to do basketball or volleyball, they had snap court systems that could go in. So it's being able to, in smaller communities, you have to have a flexible venue. You have to have as many multi-use spaces as possible, because that's how you design and eventually operate a facility that's not going to have those dark periods, because dark periods are how you lose money. You've got to have people coming through it all the time. You've got to be able to sell annual memberships. People are only going to buy those if they know this is something I'm going to use regularly, and as the seasons change, there's different things I'm going to do here, and I know my whole family's going to get use out of it as well. It's not just a particular age. Youth programs, you've got adult programs, you've got senior programs. So really having a focus on how do we maximize the usage of this facility and the usage of every space within the facility is really, in communities this size, the only chance that it has to truly be feasible in the long term.
So a follow-up question to what you just did. You continue to mention the size of our community, which we're all extremely well aware of, and the distance to travel from Seward to the next community of any size. But when you're analyzing your user groups, will you be taking into effect the massive amount of economic that comes in from tourism? And we currently know 4 months out of the year, we are a lot larger than the 2,700 people who are here. And will you be taking into account those possible user groups to, offset the ROI on the size of the building?
Yeah, so in the summer, that's probably, so when we put together the revenue model, these facilities can have, there's lots of different types of revenue, but the two biggest sources are typically going to be rent, so to a club team, to a tournament organizer, to a league organizer, you're going to charge them rent to come in and organize their events within your spaces. And then the other big one, a lot of times the biggest one, is memberships. Memberships can be everything from an annual family membership to a monthly individual pass to a daily punch pass. So what you're talking about, I think, if I'm understanding correctly, is during the summer when you have all these tourists coming through, what about how are they going to come spend money at the facility as well? That's probably going to be, your punch pass users, I would think, quite a bit. Unless there's a tour group or something like that wants to, rent out a space for an event, things like that. We'll absolutely consider that. We look at every community as unique, and I think we'll have to look at, during the summer, what that could mean for the operating model and revenue model. And like I said before, I think from an indoor sports standpoint, there could potentially be opportunities to look at, winter sports, indoor events that could be held that would attract tourism in the winter months as well, and whether that's something worth pursuing from a.
So basically you're saying that the user groups you're going to be analyzing are sports and rec uses. That's basically it. Because that's what you keep referring back to, correct?
Well, I mean, we've been hired to do a community recreation center study.
Oh, I know, I got to
And so-
vote on the spending
I
of
guess
money.
it sounds like there's a,
Well, no, I want us to be able to put together a building that the city isn't gonna put out a ton of money on and not get the money back in a, you know. a
so we
realistic timeframe.
define, I think I said this earlier, we define recreation very broadly. So as we go through our study and we hear from a lot of different people that, hey, there's nowhere for meetings. Like, then we'll come back and say, hey, you know, you might consider having a meeting space within here or a flexible space that could also be used for meetings. There's no place for, you know, so I guess if there's other components you're talking, you know, if.
Well,
I don't know.
for instance, the project that we did in Wisconsin was a permanent ice sheet on one side and temporary ice sheet on the other. That temporary ice sheet was, I mean, the list of things that we were looking to attract on there were unbelievable. Car shows,
Right.
For sure.
car sales,
Right.
implement dealerships coming in the winter, and so we had, how do you facilitate that? You had to have storage to get everything off the floor, to open it up, you have to have doors big enough to bring in.
Right.
I mean, they want to be able to bring a combine into this space and have ag shows
Right.
in the facility. So those are the sort of things we're looking for. And calling it a rec center, I mean, that's what it's called, but, I mean, when we do a lot of these facilities, we've done wellness centers, we've done rec centers, we've done community centers, we've done what we call lifestyle centers. And lifestyle centers probably those things that cover everything. And it's still a rec center, you know, in its bones, but you look at those super flexible things that you can do it. You know, maybe there's partnering things that you can do with the cruise people that are coming in. So there's a pre-staging function, something that happens in a facility like that. It's just a conversation with them and saying, hey, what would you need that's not in the community right now to make that experience work better for your people? So we don't want to ignore any of that. We want to pull all that.
There's a reason this research process is.
It's pretty broad brushed.
8 to 10 weeks.
But I get what you're saying. You know, we use the word rec center, and this isn't about a basketball court and some weights. This is broader
Well,
brush.
I understand that, I'm trying to do some of the math in my head, and I'm excited about seeing, that's one of the reasons why I was behind.
Yeah, we'll
hiring you guys.
follow the
I'm
research. I mean,
excited
we're not coming in and saying it's this type of facility, let's try to
Right.
bring this into the community. We're gonna follow the research. And so if we talk to people and conduct all these interviews and do the survey, that when you add up all the people who responded and we talked to and everything, it's hundreds of people.
Great.
You know, we'll identify what the gaps are. And sometimes it comes back and it's just totally typical. Other times it comes back and it's like, well, we're okay here, but in this particular community, we need this, this, and this. And it's, you know, some of that might be something that's been done in another community, some of that might be unique to this community. We're gonna tell you what that demand profile is, and so we'll follow it where it goes. You know, we're not gonna just say, here's a cookie cutter that went there, let's plop it down here and see if it works. That's not what we do.
Yeah, I'm excited about the process.
When we did the Choice Wellness Center in Grand Forks, it's a wellness center, rec center, but it's more of a lifestyle center when it really got finished. We knew that the local healthcare provider wanted some sports acceleration components to it, which fits in a rec center really well.
Mhm.
But where it went is, they almost have a full-fledged clinic in this building. They have dietary functions, they have wound care in there, they treat the obese in there. There's just a number of things that they do in that facility. And people are much more inclined to go to a facility like that than go to a hospital or a clinic. And it gives them so many more things to do when they do get there. It entices them to come in the doors. And it's been a really, really successful model for them. We never saw that one coming. About a third of the square foot. This is over 100,000 square foot facility. Big component was that we knew it was going to be aquatics. Another big component we knew was going to be tennis courts, so 6 tennis courts. So this is a big facility. We had no idea how much that local healthcare provider was going to end up wanting.
And that's driven by their unique place in that particular market.
Mhm.
It was driven by the study that came in. We didn't know that going in. And when we did the study, they came back and said, you guys need to really rethink your modeling.
Right.
There's a lot of square feet you're looking for. And so we responded to that, and the building was really different than what we thought it was gonna be going in, really different.
I have two questions real quick. When you say community, are we talking the city of Seward, the 2,500 people within the city limits, or like the 6,000 people?
That was one of the first questions I asked in the first meeting this morning with some of the city staff. And they said, you know, I think you have to assume that anything that gets done here is gonna draw from beyond city limits. And if you pretended otherwise, you'd be kidding yourself.
Right.
And so you have to factor that in.
And then my second question, you mentioned you've got a couple sites you're already looking at. Can you tell us what those sites are?
So we're just starting that process. We asked the city's community development department if they could identify some parcels, preferably that were city-owned or publicly owned already. If they could identify some that were at least 5 acres, I think.
Yeah, 5 acre lots.
5 acre lots, preferably rectangular or close to that, or square. And so they pulled, 4 or 5 sites already that just met that criteria, and sent them to us. We're also, as we go through our process, gonna be asking different folks if they're aware of any other sites. You know, I think being able to have a site that's already publicly owned or controlled by somebody who would be willing to be a donor to eliminate that cost, which could be several millions of dollars just to acquire a site, is hugely beneficial to the financial feasibility of the project. So that's where we start. That's where we're starting right now. Again, we'll kind of follow other opportunities that come up if people say, hey, you know, maybe look at this site. A lot of times we look at repurposing existing facilities that may be empty, that, you know, have high ceilings that can, you know, and have they'll have pillars every 3 feet, things like that. So we'll build that out over the next couple of weeks, or really, you know, as part of that research process, what some of the potential sites out there are, and then we have them looking at for detailed analysis up to 3 sites. And so we'll sit down and put our heads together and kind of look at all of the sites we gathered, kind of narrow down to the handful that we think could make the most sense during this phase. Doesn't mean that's absolutely gonna be the site, but it's just a kind of a process of trying to gather as many potential sites as we can, and then filter through them and see what makes sense in terms of, are they zoned properly, do they have the right utilities and things.
All those things can really, you know, have an impact on the cost. You know,
Right.
just what side of the site utilities come in on, and where do you want to enter the site, and all those sort of things.
We look at sites sometimes that look awesome, and then architects and engineers go in and like, okay, this soil's bad, you know, only a third of this is actually usable because of the way that water collects on the site, and then all these types of things that, you know, we're the numbers guys and the research guys. There's a reason they're here too.
We're given 6 sites, and we're a little sensitive on, 3 of the sites are quasi-public sites, and so that's not a big deal. A little sensitive to private sites to talk about those earlier,
Right.
just it cause inflated costs, just kind of,
Right.
you know.
Yeah.
So we just want to be careful about how we approach all that.
And they're, you know, privately owned sites, we don't even have the owner's permission to
Right.
put in a public study and things like that, so.
I guess
we-
it would just be the public sites. We have
Right.
there was a group in town, the Seward Ice and Multi-Sport Association, that formed a few years ago. And we had identified 3 locations and a few priorities, and I just thought maybe I'd want to see if that was on your list.
Okay, yeah, I mean, if, that's also something you could email us and we'd be happy to take a look at, yeah, for sure. Yeah.
I mean, the filters that we handed off to have sites brought back to us, you know, if those filters were a little too stringent, and something, we had ended up with a 4-acre site, it probably should work. And if something was overlooked just because it wasn't at 5, we certainly want to go back and take a look at it. We're committed, our firm is committed to working a minimum of 3. If we end up having to look at 4 or 5, I'm not going to rule that out, but we're for sure going to do 3 different sites. That's part of our study, that's what we're funded for.
So my question is actually now is for you from an engineering perspective, and you looked around in the history of what you've done in these facilities, the shift away from fossil fuels for heat, I mean, that would be a major cost year after year. So where have you grown in your capacity to, especially coming from the North Dakota region, where have you grown to show that, and through the study to show that we can increase some capital costs by potentially leveraging some federal monies in there for the sustainability piece, which is something we probably know quite a bit about.
Yep. These facilities lend themselves pretty well, depending on what all is in there. The Choice Financial Wellness Center that we did in Grand Forks is 100% geothermal wells. And geothermal wells work well in this type of a building, for the most part. They don't work well in areas where you need high comfort, because the air temperature that comes off a geothermal system is cooler than, a direct fired system. So that it can feel drafty, but when you're in a larger facility like this, that's usually not a big problem. But the other thing that we've been looking at, very, very effective use of systems and reheat capture. You've got single pass air in your locker rooms in a lot of these spaces like this, but we capture that heat back. We don't recirculate it, but we draw the heat out of that air before it goes outside. So there's a lot of things we do to make the building inherently more effective before we even look at alternatives. The big thing right now and I'm not 100% sure about your sunshine days, your gray days here, but photovoltaics and solar has become really much more affordable. Those panels have come down significantly in cost. I just don't know what that payback would be here. I don't know about, I have to study that the microclimate here to make sure that does make sense. But geothermal pretty much makes sense almost anywhere.
A lot of that is a payback analysis.
Yep.
It's, yes, you're getting different types of funds and grants, but most of them are designed to partially offset the additional cost. So a lot of it is looking at, does it make a sense from an economic feasibility standpoint to pursue that particular, each opportunity for upgrades.
We are not necessarily starting with the thought that this is a LEED certified building, but when we do our projects, our clients have come to us several times that we expect an effective and efficient operating building. We're not necessarily looking to spend 40 grand to get a plaque on the wall. We want it to be an efficient building. So we haven't done a lot of platinum and gold and those sort of certifications on LEED, but we do very, very efficient buildings. And that's I think it's always been part of our culture and our bloodstream is to do that, because we have engineers and architects working together in the same office. Whereas most architects hire an engineer. I'm an architect, I live with those engineers.
There's a lot of jokes in there.
No,
I like it.
we work together on a daily basis, and I think it's we're much more sensitive to that as a baseline that our buildings are effective and efficient.
Thank you.
Any other questions?
I'd like to reiterate Kirk's point of having a midpoint community input session. If there's any way that presentation you do to the city, if that could be open to the public, I think that could be really valuable. This community really needs to, I'm not saying you're gonna have too many people, I'm just saying that the fact that you had that and that was available to people to come in and see where we were and see.
We can talk to the city about that and see what they can do. I mean, we have our scope already defined and all that with our meetings, but we can talk to the city about whether that's something that could be added and how that might look.
Or even if it just could be an open meeting at city
Right.
council, so
Okay.
people can listen in.
Gotcha. Oh, yeah, we'll absolutely talk
Valuable.
with the city about that and see what we can. Okay. All right, well, thank you very much for your time, and we appreciate you coming and listening to us and having so many great questions. And, I'll leave you with the fact that our process is very research-driven, and we can only report back what people tell us. So if you don't say anything, it's not going to be in there. So don't be shy. use the channels that we have, the email address, the survey,
Spread the word out.
spread the word out, different ways to
That's a big thing.
participate, and, the more we learn, the better information we can get. So, thank you.
Thank you.
Next.